to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name's Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. Our lecture today is sponsored by Speedway Properties. If you're interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can find our membership at preservelincoln.org. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster County in the 1870s. He has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J. and L. Lee Company, a publisher of regional books, as well as a coinery. He has written over 1,500 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission, and he's also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is number 42 in a series of talks about the complete history of Lincoln. Please join me in welcoming Jim.
Might add, it's number 42 of 12. And interestingly enough, when we started it, I think there are about half a dozen that aren't numbered, so we're even a little bit over that. We had the suburbs came along before we started the number series, and when we first talked about it, we thought we could probably do everything in 12. But what we forgot is they keep making new history every day. So that's the reason it's number 46, but it should be 50-something. Today's program is, first of all, a little bit of cleanup, which I didn't finish quite my program on landing in Lincoln, the airfields of Lincoln. So for a couple minutes, we'll finish up that program. Gordon Schultz helped me put this together. Some of the program we'll be doing today was actually put together by John Strope probably over a year ago. I never quite got to. So we'll be doing a little bit of cleanup in both areas. So this first slide and the first couple of topics are part of the Lincoln Landing or Landing in Lincoln series. And obvious to everybody, this is the corner of 66th and O Streets, probably taken in the 1950 eras. And this is the Conant airfield. We are hovering over 66th and O Streets, looking pretty much to the northwest in this picture. The area was owned by Harold Conant. In 1931, he invented something called the selenium rectifier. Which was a way of converting AC to DC with no moving parts. Mr. Conant had, I think, 17 patents on the atomic submarine, for example, or copyrights or patents more probably. He bought this property in the late 1930s, about 60 acres of land, which started at 66th and O Streets and ran towards the northwest, clear up to Dead Man's Run in the north and almost up to, well, where the Banker's Life later would purchase Gateway Shopping Center to the west. So he had about 60 acres of land in there, and he started with the building on the right-hand side. There are three pictured there. The one on the right, which is actually on 66th Street, is where he first bought and built a laboratory there. He later gave that property to his father-in-law, Charlie Booth, who some of you may remember was a woodworker and also on the faculty of Nebraska's East Campus. Then he built the property kind of in the dead center of the picture, towards the west a little bit. That building was the one I kind of remember clearly because he had a son who was exactly my age. I lived on South Cotner Boulevard, and between our house and Bethany, there was him. That was it. So the only person I really knew in the area was Steve Conant, his son. The house was interesting. You can see it looks like a rectangular area, but most of what you're looking at is a paved parking lot right there. The house, kind of a mini mansion, was on the left-hand side and had grass all the way around it. This direction was the laboratory, which was connected to the house by a tunnel, which as a kid in grade school and junior, this was fascinating. I'll tell you, having a tunnel between the buildings. He could move around in the dead of winter without any trouble. The building to the right was actually built as an enclosed swimming pool, which it was while I was growing up, but later interest in swimming disappeared almost by the time he finished the building, and it became part of the laboratory where he manufactured millions of these tiny little parts, selenium rectifiers. He also had an airfield there, which is why we have him at this point, and we can see the airfield behind the house. He also built that. He called it a lake, but it very rarely had water in it. He couldn't keep water in it. It just kept filling in and filling in and filling in. So it was mostly a mud flat. The airfield ran from the southwest to the northeast pretty much. He also later will build a hangar. He had 2 airplanes that he kept on the property. We're not sure exactly which ones were there, but we do know that he managed to crash land one of them right in front of his family as he was bringing it from the airport out. Same property, but in this picture, and Harold hired someone to take a series of pictures. This one is hovering over probably what we would today have at Eastmont Towers, looking directly north. You can see, again, the facility with his house on the left right there, and you can see the lake still has water in it in this picture. By 1981, he had unsuccessfully, his attorney said, for a certain amount of money, I will guarantee you, you will never be in the city limits of Lincoln. Well, that doesn't work very well ever. Pretty soon, the city literally existed all the way around him. He will sell the property, and most everybody thinks it became part of Gateway, but it was a separate owner at that time. It's attached to Gateway, but Montgomery Ward's was the primary resident there, and then later Gateway will extend into that area as Gateway, and they're even all connected together, but they're 2 separate owners. The buildings will all be gone on the lower right-hand side by 1981. McDonald's will probably be the property, which almost fits exactly there. You can still see part of the berm which held up the swimming pool, and that's about all that's left of it. It was also listed as an airfield, and as a reason we kept it into this part of the program, the airfield, and it could be landed in, but probably only in an emergency. The next airfield still kind of exists. About 1960, a man by the name of Paul Eden, as in E-D-E-N, lived on South 48th Street, 2745 South 48th, and he had a truck farm in that general area. Ed, I guess you would probably live almost in some of his property. I'm not sure whether you've ever looked back to see, but that's why Eden Pool is so named, Eden Circle, and so forth. He had a house there a little bit later on, but he also developed a sky ranch out on O Street in the late 1960s. He called it Eden's Sky Ranch, and the idea was to build a facility with a grass runway where every house that was located along this runway would have hangar and access to the grass runways. 6 houses were built initially. He had a 1,700-foot grass runway, which again ran on a diagonal slightly. The lower level of each house, as we can see in this one, was a hangar. Apparently there are a couple of them which still kind of have the hangar influence, but most of them have been converted to rooms within a house. The names of the streets which he platted in the area were Beechcraft Road, Cessna Lane, and Piper Way, for example, all had a theme like that. By 1970, there were about 28 houses built there. Not all of them had hangars, but all of them were built with access to the grass runways. This particular photograph shows a chap by the name of Jack Clausen, who was a young man who lived on Cessna Drive, and there behind him is an airplane he built out of a kit called an RV-4. He worked for Silverhawk Aviation, and at the time these pictures were taken, he said he flew to work every morning, which you still could, I think. If you look today at a list of emergency airfields in the area, you'll find this still listed, and a phone number you're to call if you want to land there. I wouldn't suggest it because they haven't been mowing the grass lately, but it's still listed as an emergency airfield, and it's still there and visible, but that's just about it. One of the chaps who flew quite regularly out of here didn't live there. This was a doctor whose name was Dr. Carruthers. He was a dentist, and he flew a single-engine aircraft, which he also had built, one of them. And in November of 1985, he was flying a demonstration demonstration out of the field. It was being filmed by KMTV, which is both good news and bad news, because he lost power crashed into the ground at a 45-degree angle. Never quite sure exactly what was happened. He didn't die on the spot, but he was pinned inside his aircraft for an hour and 15 minutes because, of course, the Lincoln Fire Department had to respond. Before they got him out, it was an hour and 15 minutes. He lived for a short time but died at Lincoln General Hospital on January the 3rd of 1986. So Dr. Carruthers, well-known pilot in the area, but primarily experimental and demonstration flights. There had been one other crash on that same airfield in 1968, just as it was being completed. The area was purchased by a guy by the name of Lee Pester, P-E-S-T-E-R, and if you look it up today, the airfield has a number and it's called the Pester Airfield. So it's extant, but just barely. The last airfield that we listed is still listed as an airfield, and I'm not sure why, because it's Duncan Field, which is, for some strange reason, listed as an airfield, but it has no runways except attached to the Lincoln Municipal Airport. So Duncan is the last of the airfields that we wanted to talk about some months ago. Now we'll pick back up with John Strope's slides that he put together for me and talk about the Bohannon Brothers livery stable and the Bohannon Brothers in general. Gilbert Bohannon was the first brother to arrive in Lincoln. He came from Plattsmouth and Nebraska City and built what was called the Central Meat Market at 937 O. His brother, Walter, arrived in 1869, very early on in the city at that point, 2 years old. His brother, on his arrival, said he had a net worth of negative $35, but he joined the firm as one of the Bohannon brothers. 1875, they built 2 livery stables. This is the one which we think of most usually. It was on 11th Street, and one of the reasons I think of it instantly is if you look to the right or to the north of the building, we're looking towards the southwest in this line drawing, you can see what kind of appears to be the beginning of a sidewalk over water, and that's because there was a bridge there which bridged the, what do we call it, an arroyo, I guess, because it did carry water regularly, which headed about where today's Children's Museum is, or the current, well, we used to think of it as the Rock and Roll Runza, but now it's Wells Fargo Bank. Banks have a way of moving, changing names, and selling out, but what we used to think of as Rock and Roll Runza, now the Wells Fargo Bank. Below that, there was an artesian well, which had about a 4-inch head. Water flowed from there. It flowed towards the west, went underneath the old Wells Fargo, now Union Bank. I have to stop and think what bank is there now. Was a National Bank of Commerce. It flowed under that building, then took a diagonal towards the southwest, crossed O Street at 12th Street, fell into a east-west drainage ditch, which went straight down the alley between N and O and emptied into Salt Creek, and it still does. In fact, there's a arched stone tunnel which picks up kind of in the middle of the block, which is the old Southeast Community College now block. It still carries water, but most of that water is no longer artesian flow. That artesian flow dried up pretty much as the area is paved over and there's no inflow to serve the well. We get a lot of air conditioner condensate and a lot of storm sewer runoff, but it still runs right there towards and directly empties into Salt Creek several blocks to the west. So he also built at the same time, the brothers did, the Peoria House Hotel. Then in 1882, this is the new livery stable, which sits on the same site as that one, now a brick building. Again, we're now looking pretty much towards the west. They bought another livery stable, and they bought an omnibus line in 1882, 1884. Another brother, Edward, comes and he starts something called the Columbia Fire Insurance Company. Same stable again. This is also where the Lincoln Fire Department will keep their Silsbee fire engine for a while. 1887, he will build Bohannon's Hall, which was a large building on the southwest corner of 10th and N Streets, and it was listed then as the largest public hall in Nebraska, 100 feet by 106 feet on the ground level. July of 1890, a little over 800, some say 1,000 farmers and labor leaders met at that hall, the Bohannon Brothers Public Hall, to form what they called the Populist Movement. It started right in that building. 1900, they built 2 livery stables, both of which, interestingly enough, are still extant. They built the Windsor stable, and the Palace stable. The Windsor stable is now called the Green Gateau Annex, and the Palace stable is between 11th and 12th on M, directly across the street south from St. Paul Methodist Church. And it's now owned by Speedway Properties, that one. By about 1920, the brothers were all gone. Interestingly, they represented everything in the city of Lincoln. There were some of them were Democrats, some were Republicans, some were Baptists, some were Episcopals. So like an insurance salesman, they covered all their bets. The Roman and Drain Carriage Works. Didn't realize that this is not a very clear picture. We can't blame this on Gordon. This is just a bad slide. Charles Roman came to Lincoln as a carriage repairman in 1877. He worked for another firm. Then in 1882, Andrew Drain came to Lincoln, and they formed Roman and Drain at 1123, which they called a kind of wagon manufacturer. Basically, they were building carriages originally made to order. In 1884, they built this 4-story building. It looks like a 3-story building, but they're counting the sunlight basement or the walk-under as well, obviously. At 127 South 15th Street, which would put it just to the north of the alley, and kind of think of it as being near the old YWCA, slightly to the north of there. 1894, Mr. Drain left, and in 1898, Mr. Roman left, and the Roman and Drain Carriage Works were but a memory. This is a letter, and this is where the illustration came from. Now we actually have a photograph of the building, but didn't use it in this slide. These were put together some years ago. This is a letter which tells a story. It's dated April 13th of 1891. The president of the firm then was the president of the United States then was Benjamin Harrison. And he began in April of 1891 a journey towards California. 9,232 miles, he said, altogether. He would take him to California and back. He wanted to talk to Leland Stanford. Of course, Stanford University was what he was after. He wanted to talk to Mr. Stanford about the possibility of obtaining a professorship at Stanford University. I don't know what became of the professorship, but he did manage to, in a 5-car train, visit 72 cities on his way to and back from California. 19 states were covered. Basically, in each city, he stopped and gave a 5-minute talk from the back of the train. But in Lincoln, Nebraska, when he arrived here, he arrived at 7th and O Streets, and a great 21-gun salute greeted him, and it's not going to be a 5-minute stop. He will then form, and the letter tells the story, he forms a parade down O Street to 15th Street, and at 15th Street, he turns to the right or to the south, and he said, at this building, they estimated the crowd on the Capitol grounds at 25,000. This sounds like something the newspaper would have reported, how you count a 25,000 group of gathering, and that's a phenomenal percentage of the city of Lincoln at that time. But he met at the Capitol, and there he gave an outdoor 45-minute speech on the North Capitol steps. The letter goes on to say that he briefly paused, didn't stop, but paused in front of Carriage of Drain, and he tipped his hat to their 12-foot United States American flag. That's what the letter says. How much of it we can believe to you. lighting the city of Lincoln is the premise of the next bunch of slides. This picture is taken on the Rock Island tracks, not too far from what today would be the Children's Zoo's entrance. Probably we're a little bit north of that. We're looking towards the south. In about 1870, Lincoln was first in the business of producing, using the word producer gas. And producer gas was manufactured in Lincoln at about 6th and N Street. Sometimes that address looks like it's more like 5th and M or over on M Street. And at that point in time, we're using producer gas to light the city of Lincoln. So this is, think of it as natural gas, but it isn't. It's being produced by burning coal, pouring water and so forth over it. It produces a gas. They captured it in a gasometer, a gas device, big circular thing, which expands and contracts. And that was there when I was a kid. Certainly, maybe even by the time I started university, that gas holder was still there down in that same area. By 1880, the city of Omaha urged the city of Lincoln to switch to electricity for illumination. And in 1894, having ignored that for the time being, the First National Bank and the Clifton House put in kerosene streetlights in front of their buildings. They cost $6 each, and they cost them, they said, to light these fixtures, they spent about 3.5 cents per night on kerosene to light the sidewalk in front of their buildings. The city also at that point in time authorized the use of buying kerosene fixtures for downtown Lincoln, but they would not buy the kerosene, so they were not immediately lit. In the meantime, 1885 comes along, and the Lincoln Street Railway begins to generate its electricity for its streetcars, and they sold excess electricity to downtown Lincoln, but this was primarily, if not entirely, direct current. So most of it was not used for lighting. A lot of it that was used for things like elevators, which used direct current more appropriately. These 6 generators put out 80,000 watts of electricity. There were some city sales, as I said, but not a great deal. One of the guys, Mr. Imhoff, instituted something called the Lincoln Electric Light Company, and 45 entrances or connections to this, their facilities were ordered by downtown businessmen. By 1886, the city of Lincoln had 21 electric street lights. Some of these were arc lamps, which would be direct current, some of them were not. But it was costing the city at that time $12 per month to operate those lights. City council, in their infinite wisdom, said that is too much. We cannot afford $12 per month. By 1887, the streetcar company was still selling electric lights to parties downtown. Then in 1892, a new plant was built at 2nd and M Streets. And at that point in time, they were also shuffling their coal gas or producer gas in 20 miles of wooden pipes, which ran primarily in the downtown area. And they were using 8,000 tons of coal a year in making this producer gas. By 1900, the gas and electric companies, which were producing lights, merged, and they maintained at that point about 340 arc lights over intersections in the city in various places. And they also operated, they said, about 4,000 incandescent lights. They maintained still 40 miles of gas wooden pipes underneath the city and 45 miles of electric lines overhead. When in the 1950s, the city tore up 9th Street towards the power plant, and at that point in time, they discovered, much to their surprise, that there were still wooden pipes under 9th Street still transporting gas. By this time, probably natural gas, not producer gas. And it seems unbelievable to us. Tom Lutzy, who some of you remember, actually went down and salvaged some of those pipes and still had them. I don't know what ultimately became of them, but Tom collected one of everything, I think, and he had some of those wooden pipes which are still used. And of course, the gas pressure is very low. I think 7 to 14 pounds per square inch, so it's not a high, but interestingly enough, they still served. By 1905, we'll move on a little bit here. I realize I'm talking ahead of the pictures a little bit. 1905, Lincoln then bought a 40-acre tract of land, which is what we were looking at just now, and again here, between 27th and 30th A and D Street for $13,500. Then they will build this plant, also known as the original A Street pumping plant and electric generating later. A secondary picture of the same plant shows it with the Rock Island Railroad tracks running right by it, and you can still see the route of that, which runs by the Children's Zoo and carries on towards the southeast. They used the balance of this land mostly for parkland. They did sink water wells all over in it, and this was the primary reason, I think, for acquiring the land in the first place, was the city water wells, which had been down at on the west edge, the northwest edge actually, of Cooper Park, and in that area were producing literally all the fresh water for the city of Lincoln. But they decided at some point in there that they would sink a second well very close to the first well, which was their undoing, because there was a strata of clear fresh water which went under Lincoln towards the north primarily, but went as far as Denton off towards the southwest. And when they sunk the second well, they discovered to their dismay that that thickness of that bed of water was just a matter of a few feet, and they sucked water out of that aquifer so quickly that the salt water which was around it began to come in. And instead of getting all fresh water, they started getting all water mixed with salt water, and that is not a good thing. So they bought this property out there primarily for that. And if you wander around still in this area, you'll still see a few wellheads, particularly the ones that are about so high. They're no longer being used, and of course all of the little brick buildings which you had, which ran all the way up and down the Rock Island tracks and along the parkland there, none of that is still being used to produce water out of the ground. They're using some of the cisterns, which are underground, huge underground reservoirs, but no water is being sucked out of the ground there. That water all comes from Ashland, which, interestingly enough, when Lowell and I went out to look at the damage to Gardner Industries, we realized that one of the pumping stations that pumps up the water coming from Ashland, right there between Gardner Industries and the drug company, is where there's a City of Lincoln pumping plant which repumps the water. Maybe that's where the chlorine is added. I'm not sure about that. But at any rate, that tornado missed it by just blocks. And how lucky are we? Came out unscathed. Later, the light plant on A Street will be known as the Mockett Well and the A Street Power Plant. This is the interior. In 1907, William Jennings Bryan gave an additional 10 acres of land within what now will be known as Antelope Park, and at that time as well, between 27th and 30th as well. 1913, the city leased an additional 13-acre tract of land in that same area called the Perkins Tract. Then in 1915, William Auld, A-U-L-D, bought the Perkins Tract, 18,654 acres plus another 4,500 acres of land, apparently. At that time, he offered to sell it to the City of Lincoln at his cost, but the City of Lincoln demurred, not having the cash in hand, and Mr. Auld, bless his heart, gave all that land to the City of Lincoln. So the great bulk of what we call Antelope Park today that wasn't given by Mr. Bryan was given by Mr. Auld. And of course, in thanks to Mr. Auld, the city erected the Auld Pavilion, and they named it the Auld Pavilion. At that point in time, it was the largest gift that the City of Lincoln had ever received. And by that, I take it they mean in terms of land and or cash. 1916, the traction company is still producing electricity and selling it to the city, but almost all the electricity that it's used by citizens comes from the municipal plant. Another interior. 1922, the city will build the 9th and K Street plant across the street, which is no longer owned by the city. Well, is it? I'm not sure. They're trying to, have they sold it? I'm not sure. The idea was to put it back on the tax rolls, and last I knew, the city still owned it, but at some point they will get out of that. 1939, Consumers Public Power District was organized. 1940, they and Norris Public Power District are providing most all the electricity to the city of Lincoln. 1953, Nathan Gold, Gold's Department Stores, and Consumers Public Power District solicited the Atomic Energy Commission to put a reactor in Nebraska. The AEC urged them to consider using a sodium graphite reactor, which would also have other uses as well as simply producing electricity. 1955, Atomic Energy Commission approved, and land was purchased at Hallam, Nebraska, and additionally a coal-fired plant was built. This is the building over here, which, as I said, I'm not sure where the ownership lies now. 1963, the shortly used Hallam Atomic Energy Plant was closed and sealed off. So it only generated atomic energy electricity for about a year and a half. But the second plant there uses both natural gas and coal. To stop and think, what on earth are we talking about now? To back up a little bit and finish that off, the OPPD built a nuclear plant at Fort Calhoun, 1967, and by 1980, Nebraska's electricity was still 56% generated by coal and natural gas, 25% by nuclear power, and interestingly enough, 18% by water power. But almost all of that water power was generated in tiny little facilities like the one at Blue Springs, Nebraska, where they really operated on a very limited basis, producing electricity just for Blue Springs area. But maybe some of it was added to the grid, I'm not sure. By 1999, Lincoln Electric Service had put in 2 wind turbines, 660 kilowatt power generation north of the city of Lincoln, about where the new city dump is going to be built. Then in 2007, it was noted that there were 46 turbines in the state of Nebraska. That number has undoubtedly grown, although there's a great deal of objection to it too, so I'm not sure. Okay, now we are going to talk briefly about Dr. W.G., and I don't know how to pronounce it for H-O-U-T-Z, Houts. He came to Lincoln in about 1880. Never practiced medicine here in the city of Lincoln, but he built 2 housing developments and also incorporated the Lincoln Loan and Trust Company. He became the vice president of that company. Then in 1881, he built this house, which he said was on Capitol Avenue. Capitol Avenue is kind of a floating target. Some people say it became 20th Street, but Capitol Avenue still exists quite beyond 20th Street. He built this house on 4 lots there, which belonged to Jacob Dawson, another man we have talked about in early Lincoln quite a little bit, 2.5 stories tall. Then in 1909, as a separate institute, in a separate building, Mary Whitton, W-H-I-T-T-O-N, and Julie Carlisle established a girls' academy, which think of it as a girls' high school. It was located at 18th and A Street and accepted as pupils girls from the age of 6 to 16. 1911, the Lincoln Chamber of Commerce established a stock company to underwrite their school. They raised $16,400 by the sale of stock to help the school operate. The board of directors of that school included some people we know today. J.C. Sechrest, Joseph Granger, and Mrs. William Jennings Bryan were on the board. Very well thought of. In 1912, they bought the Houts mansion for $17,000, which by this time looks more like this. It has a tower attached to it. And they also set about building a 45 by 56 foot gymnasium and dormitory, which they planned but didn't completely build. Boys at this point in time began being admitted as day school students. In other words, they would not be boarded, but they would be accepted as students, Whitten, Carlisle were paid $900 a year total to be the teachers and directors of the school, but that was reduced almost immediately to 750 students. By 1921, Lincoln Public Schools was becoming certainly more well thought of, and their enrollment dropped to 58, and 9 of those were boarders staying overnight. Interestingly enough, I knew a lady whose name was Proudfit. Her father started the Proudfit Lumber Company, but Mary Key Proudfit, later Mary Key Crable, was actually a student here. 1926, the house was bought by First Plymouth Congregational Church, and they also bought the house next door, which would be to the north. Total paid for the 2 properties, $32,348. 1926, the Whitten Carlisle School closed, and both of them taught in Topeka at Bethany College, so they were gone. The remnant of all this is Capitol Avenue, which exists as little more than an alley, but it is a street. There are, I think, 2, possibly 3 addresses on Capitol Avenue. Very narrow little property, not really 20th Street, but it's a separate street called Capitol Avenue, which is what he called his address when the house was originally built. One of the interesting things about Lancaster County and the city of Lincoln is the fact that, getting ahead of myself. We're going to talk first about Gregory's Basin, Gregory's Basin. This is the creek which runs through there. In 1862, a man by the name of John Gregory came to the area, and he located on Middle Creek, and when he got there, all that was there, he said, was a band of about 100 Pawnee who were camped there. They had gone over to the salt flats to gather salt. He built a dugout, supposedly, in this creek, but it's a misnomer to point out this as the creek because they've changed the route of the creek enough times that it's hard to say exactly where it was. But by 1864, he built a post office on the banks of the creek, which he called Gregory's Basin. In 1868, he built a frame house there. Later on, some of you may remember White's Animal Clinic, and this would be the property which John Gregory actually existed on. And there is some evidence that early on when he was there, and maybe even towards the end, that he had a white frame, sort of a shed on his building, which may have been the original Gregory's post office. No way of proving it. We don't know for sure. So about 3rd and Charleston. Charleston is going to be the new name of, I believe it's Z or Z Street. So from A to Z, that's where the north boundary of the original plat went. In 1867, there was a brickyard not far on the creek, and that's what this picture is supposed to represent, a brickyard near and maybe just to the west of the drug company that is out there on our way to the airport today. By 1880, the area was served by 2 railroads, Union Pacific and the Burlington Railroad. 1881, a hog butchery was set up on the site. 1884, the Nebraska Stockyards Company existed there. The brickyard and the stockyards and almost everything that's built out there is owned by John Fitzgerald, whose house sat between A Street and D Street, between 17th Street and 20th Street in that huge tract of land called Mount Emerald, now a district. He was also later the president of the First National Bank and was known as Lincoln's first millionaire, but he's not the guy we want to talk about at this point in time. He owned literally and developed the city of West Lincoln. In 1885, he platted West Lincoln on 2 sections of land and started talking about many improvements which he would build on the site. So Gregory's post office is considered to be the first post office in Lincoln, but in actuality, it probably would more reasonably be called West Lincoln. It would have been near the salt flats at that time. By 1887, West Lincoln claims a population of 480, and Mr. Fitzgerald will build a building, which we'll see in a second. He also, at that time, will oversee the building of Asbury Methodist Church, which was built under the wing, if you will, of St. Paul Methodist Church. And it closed probably about the beginning of the 20th century, but the building is still there, a non-denominational church. 1888, he will also build about it, oversee many buildings. This is what was left probably, I was out there probably 25, 30 years ago, and we see, like in the foreground here, we see a big concrete slab with steel reinforcement bars coming out of it, and one of the other buildings, he literally oversaw the development of West Lincoln, which became a rather large property. I guess it only turns if I point it. There we go. And this little brick building was there. All that was left really of the manufacturing and the industrial part of West Lincoln by that time. By 1880s, there were about a dozen retail stores in West Lincoln. There was a cannery, the brickyard, and the packing plant, and all sorts of things. By the 1890s, early in the 1890s, there was a National Depression, which was one of the undoings of West Lincoln, but quite frankly, the other thing that did them in was they ran out of fresh water. And without fresh water, the canning and the meat packing were at a great disadvantage. At any rate, between the two things, the city of West Lincoln, which existed but a short time and to any great extent, expanded, and then suddenly, just literally like a balloon, collapsed. And in the 1890s, basically 1893, 94, 95, about 200 houses which had been built there were moved to Belmont, not very far, but to the east, and to Havelock, which at that time was in the process of being built and increasing in size. They also reported that they tore up the wooden sidewalks and used them for firewood. So the city of West Lincoln just is on the way out. And the stockyards, which were located there, were moved to Burnham, which probably can best be described as just a little bit and south of where Yankee Hill Brickyard is today. That's where the stockyards were located, and the city of Burnham, or the post office called Burnham. 1933, we begin to think about things being built that we remember or we know the antecedents of, or not the antecedents, but the existence of, was Royal Grove. The first Royal Grove was built, and that was to the north and a little bit east of the present Royal Grove, on what was then in West Lincoln's plat known as 2nd Street. 1935, West Lincoln approved liquor by the drink, but the village control board said they weren't very excited about it, and it sort of dragged their heels on it for a while. Then, almost immediately, Lincoln determines to annex West Lincoln. But they don't want to be annexed. For one thing, they realize they've got an area which could have things which the city of Lincoln didn't have, like liquor by the drink, the sale of fireworks of any magnitude they wanted. So the city of Lincoln decides to apply a little pressure, and they say, either you let us annex you or we will remove fire and police protection from you, which is a pretty big hand to deal. 1965, the Nebraska legislature changed the rules and allowed a city of first class or municipal grade to annex cities which were adjacent to it without a vote of the people. So they did. 1966, they simply absorbed West Lincoln and ended the possibility of liquor by the drink and so forth. 1967, the new Royal Grove was opened, which we still know as the Royal Grove, I think, but it closed very quickly. 2023, a rejuvenation occurred. Today we have ZOETIS, Pfizer Corporation. This building, which is today an apartment house, which actually was a hotel in the city of Lincoln. The other thing that's left is the little church building. And I'm not sure, as I said, I think it is a non-denominational church. It was originally a Methodist church. And if you look at the map or you drive out there and you just watch the street signs, you'll find off to the north is Main Street. And people will be completely confused if they think that's Lincoln's Main Street if they get off the plane and come to Lincoln and pass Main Street. But that's the Main Street from West Lincoln. Now we're back to really more important properties. We're back into the real city of Lincoln, where I grew up. This is Cotner and O Streets, which developed first in the 20s as from O Street to the north. North Cotner developed and connected to the Havelock paving. Then in the 30s, we're going to take it south. This is on the southeast corner of South Cotner Boulevard and O Street, which today is a two-story brick building which has a karate school in it, I think. Not sure exactly, but the section of land, the square foot, the square mile of land was entirely owned by the Taylor family, which went from A Street to O Street, from 70th Street to 56th Street. My father worked with the Taylor family. At that point in time, it was divided into 4 plats originally. Each one of the quarter sections was owned by one of the members of the Taylor family, all overseen by M.W. Taylor, whose house still stands at 244 South Cotner. Stands out among the houses in there because it's an interesting brick 2-story, really nice house with a tile roof. He also graduated from the University of Nebraska and had a degree in architecture, but he never practiced architecture. And I'm not sure he even got his degree in architecture. But he did design the house at 244 South Cotner and a couple of other really interesting buildings which did not survive. John Taylor had acquired this property in 1878 as a soldier's warrant, a square mile of land. 1925 North Cotner, 1927 on the northeast corner, which today is where Bankers Life is. They built a drive-in there, maybe one of the first drive-ins. It wasn't in the city of Lincoln, but it was certainly adjacent, called the Big Apple, which was just a canvas over board affair, which sold fruit drinks for a nickel. You'd drive up in the gravel driveway and order a 5-cent fruit drink. That was supplanted by the Ranch Market, then later is going to be purchased by Bankers Life, and it will become all of their property. But in the meantime, 1950s, over on the southeast corner of Cotner and O Streets, Mr. Taylor, M.W. Taylor, put up this, he called it a 3-story windmill. It was for all intents and purposes, a root beer stand. Sometimes it was an A&W root beer stand. Sometimes it was operated by Smith's Dairy, which we see it in this picture, and so forth. The electric, or the arms of the windmill turned by an electric motor, and they were lit. It was quite something. I remember it quite clearly as a kid. It's going to be added on to around the bottom. It's going to have, going to look like this when it's added on to. Becomes more of a proper drive-in at this point in time. 1959, we'll see the beginning of Gateway Shopping Center being constructed, and my father and about a dozen other people started a bank called Gateway Bank, and my father became the first depositor, interestingly enough. But unbeknownst to me then, of course, my now mother-in-law became one of the first 10 depositors. And my wife, who was then, just a child, opened the first PAC, checking account. So by the time we're going to ultimately move to Gateway about 9 months later, my family is very well represented there. And when I graduated, as in my senior year at the University of Nebraska, I worked for Gateway Bank after it moved over to Gateway Shopping Center. August of 1960, the bank moved over to Gateway, and at that time they had 400 accounts. 1986, Vistar and Gateway Bank acquired or merged. Then they acquired Northwest Bank and Lincoln Bank South and so forth, and pretty soon they're gone. Nothing left of them at all. 1962, the windmill was torn down, and part of it, the upper part, without the windmill part, was given to the city of Lincoln. Why the city of Lincoln accepted it is a mystery to me, but they took it and moved it out to Pioneers Park, where it quickly disintegrated into nothing and was never used for anything, as near as I could tell. But it did get moved temporarily. The land underneath it still belongs to the Taylor family. as does the property across the street to the west, which has now got a drive-in on it, and at one time there was a shopping center there. That land still all belongs to the Taylor Investment Company. And in this land right here, in the early 1960s, the Taylor Company leased the corner to Wendell Harding. And Wendell Harding was a real estate broker in the area. He had for a while even had his real estate office in the windmill. But he then, after the building was torn down, built the present two-story brick building which stands there. And if you've looked at that building, you might think to yourself, why did they build it so close to O Street? Why did they build it so close to Cotner Boulevard? Well, they knew darn well exactly what they were doing at that point in time. And you might think, well, at that time Cotner Boulevard hadn't been widened, O Street hadn't been widened. No, they had both been widened. But Wendell Harding was a pretty sharp guy, and he's going to have, I don't know whether it was a 99-year lease, but he had a long lease on the property to build that two-story building, which he leased to the federal government. Soil conservation, I think, was in there. Why was it built there, and how did it happen? Well, there was a quirk in the city ordinances at that time, and Wendell Harding took full advantage of them. On Friday afternoon, they dug trenches and poured footings. That's simple. They knew that once they got those footings at that point in history, it was there. And the city was required, I guess, to let them build on it, and they did, because they couldn't act on Saturday or Sunday, and the concrete had set and was there. There's also a house on South Cotner Boulevard that supposedly was built the same way. It runs from one edge of the lot line to the other edge of the lot line, right up to the lot line, which is not you can't do that anymore either. But it does explain why it's there, and why that property is such a peculiar shape. Let's see, we're getting pretty close. I think we'll start on the next part. We will if the slide changes. Maybe we won't. You have any idea how to change that slide? It doesn't seem to want to go. Ed knows. Oh, there's one. I tried to push up here. I tried to push there. We may use up to 5 minutes without. Here comes help. Okay. Now we'll see if it goes. Okay. A building on O Street. Okay, we'll try it. I may call. Still. Oh, okay. I got you. I'll try that. In about 1870, Charles Henry and Simon Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, came up from Plattsmouth and started a clothing business in the city of Lincoln. 1881, they established a branch first on North 10th Street. Then in 1895, John Fitzgerald knocked together, and this is the same John Fitzgerald that built West Lincoln, by the way. He knocked together some buildings on the south side of O Street from 10th to 11th, and the Simons move up to that building. 1900, the Mayer brothers operate at 10230, again, the south side of O Street right there. 1911, Eli Shire becomes the president of Mayer Brothers. 1920s, Golds will build just to the east on that O Street right there. The First National Bank will be built, of course, towards the west. The Depression, about 1931, Mayer Brothers is liquidated, and W.T. Grant opens in another building just to the west of there. 1940s, this building becomes, let's see, that's what did it. I pointed it, maybe I was just pointing it in general. I don't know. Or it could be my electric personality has shorted this whole thing out. So this is the building now that has the awning over it that we still see existing there. It's next door we have F.W. Silver's 5-cent to $1 store. Then it becomes the Three Sisters. Then the Wells Mart. Then the Gold Post Tavern and Restaurant. Then St. George and the Dragons. Then St. George and the Dragons Antique Mall. Then it was announced that they were going to build a 9-story building in there for Mac practice. Announced it, but nothing ever became of it. Well, that's interesting. Okay, that's where we went. Yeah, this is pretty much what it looks like now. And it reads as a 3-story building. It's now announced that it will be torn down and it will become either an egress for a parking lot or a little park or something to serve the original Gold's department store to the left or to the east of this building. But if you get inside this building, this beautiful O Street facade has nothing behind it. It's just some wooden story and, yeah, 2-story. It actually reads as 3, but it is a 2-story building. But there's really nothing inside. It's just barely holding on. So you may think we're losing a great building. We're losing a very old building, but not one of any consequence. I think it's all wooden beam construction, in fact. Good place to stop. I sort of glossed over that in a hurry, but we have time, I guess, for a question or two, maybe? Robert?
Comment. There was a third generation.
Just a minute. I believe we're going to send somebody with a microphone.
Here you go.
There was a third generation of Conants as well, because I was in junior high with a gentleman named Conant, a classmate of mine, and he lived on that corner, so he's probably the grandson of the founder of the
Actually,
building.
The building on the corner never belonged to the Conants. He sold that almost immediately. And that belonged to a man who had a restaurant in West O, which is still there, and I don't know what name it is now. It was a supper club originally. But he sold that, the very corner lot off originally. Now, Harold Conant, his son Steve, he divorced that Steve's mother, and he remarried Gwendolyn Conant, had Bruce and a daughter and another son. John, Bruce, and a daughter, who still live in Lincoln. One of them had a delivery service, and that may be who you're thinking of.
Yeah, he would be my age, literally,
Yeah, I was gonna say
76.
somewhat younger than I am.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and that would be either Bruce or John.
Yeah.
Although they went to Bethany School originally, of course, they obviously had to move. Harold Conant then moved out, and he bought a property just between Pioneer Park and the old Ministry Reformatory. And he was on the south side of the street right there, and he operated there until, sadly, Alzheimer's took care of it, sadly. But probably John or Bruce.
I think likely a John. Too bad we don't have buildings of comparable facade quality going on in the city
and in
today.
fact, the Smiths might just like to take that facade and store it away someplace. They sometimes do that, don't they?
Yeah.
But yeah, it is a nifty facade. But Ed, you've been in there. I think it's all wooden frame construction inside. There's nothing left in there. I think we'll call it the meeting to an end, and then we will resume and see if there are any more questions. But we'll take taping away right now.
Okay, thank you.